I think many of us are familiar with the March of the Living. I know Alan Mintz has been a leader in this important effort, which brings Jews together from North America, from Israel, a gathering at the camps, and then to Israel. And it is a remarkably powerful experience to see where we were in the 1940s during this terrible period and before during the Shoah, and what it means to have the state of Israel. In his waning days, Elie Wiesel addressed those gathered for the March of the Living, and he said this: "Indifference is not an option. The opposite of knowledge is not ignorance, it's indifference. The opposite of love is not hate, it is indifference. The opposite of beauty is not ugliness, it is indifference. The opposite of life is not death. Rather, it is indifference to life and death." In many ways, in his remarkable way, Elie Wiesel crystallizes the great sin of the Holocaust: indifference to the lives of an entire people. And indifference was not invented by the Nazis, but it has plagued humankind ever since Cain and Abel. When God came to Cain and said, "Where is your brother Abel?" And Cain said, "Am I my brother's keeper?" That is the first statement in the Bible of indifference. For Jews, memory is not an adjective, it's a verb. And so when we remember, we act, as we do during the calendar year. When we remember the going out from Egypt, we have the Seder. When we remember how God protected us during the march in the desert, we build Sukkot. And so it goes. For Jews, action is bound up in memory. Action is the opposite of indifference. And so hence, it is important for us to have memorial services like this. But it is equally important for us to act in the name of those who died, al Kiddush Hashem, for those who continue to be threatened, ad hayom hazeh, to this very day. The Torah tells us that it is a sin to remain indifferent. Al tamod al dam re'echa, ani Adonai. You shall not stand by the blood of your fellow. I am the Lord. An 18th century Sephardic commentary, the Ma'am Lo'eh, is written by Yitzchak Magriso, incorporates earlier Talmudic and medieval commentaries, and then he adds his contemporary perspective when he wrote on this verse. Included in the commandment, "Do not stand over the blood of your neighbor," is an injunction that if one sees his neighbor in danger and has the ability to do something, he must do everything in his power to help him. For example, if one sees someone drowning or attacked by murderers or wild beasts, if he can help him or bring others to do so, he is obliged to do so. If he hears that others are planning to hurt his neighbor, he has an obligation to inform him. If he knows that there is an issue that needs to be attended to, then a person has to act. It is a chiyuv. It is an obligation. We do not have the notion of the Good Samaritan in Jewish thought. Every Jew has an obligation to not stand idly by, to not be indifferent. The Shoah is an eternal reminder of the danger of indifference. And because of the world's indifference, we are left to light candles to remind us of those who were incinerated. 6 million men, women, and children. 1/3 of the Jewish people died in the Shoah. And we are left with the words of Scripture, Ner Adonai Nishmat Adam. The soul of a person is a candle of God. For those who have the yellow candle from the men's club, special Shoah candle, and those who may have a yard-side candle, I invite you to light the candle with me. We light this yellow candle to rekindle God's flame, to shine his light upon the world once again, to sanctify the memories of the millions of souls, to honor their prayers and all their lost goals. We bless their existence by being alive. To light this yellow candle is proof we have survived. We rise as Chazan Mizrahi leads us in the memorial prayer, the El Malei Rachamim.
Dayan almanot v'avi yetomim Hametzei menucha nechona Tachat kanefei hashchina B'malot kedoshim u'teorim Kezohar horokia mazhirim Et nishemot Sheshet milyonei haYehudim Anashim, Nashim v'taf שנהרגו ושנשחטו, שנשרפו, שנחנקו, ושנקברו חיים בידי המרצחים הגרמנים הנאצים, ואת עוזרי משאר העמים יימח שמם, באושוויץ, טרבלינקה, Majdanek, Mauthausen, Bergen-Belsen, Sobibor, ובשאר מחנות החשמדה. בעבור שכולנו מתפללים לעילוי נשמותיהם בגן עדן תהי מנוחתם. אונו בעל הרחמים תסתירן בסתר כנפיך לעולמים ותצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם ארץ אל תחסי דמם אדוני הוא נחלתם ינוחו בשלום על משכבותם יקומו לקץ הימים לחיותם ונאמר
May God remember the souls of the martyrs of our people who gave their lives for the sanctification of God's name, and the men, women, and children who were slaughtered, burned, and killed in the Shoah. In their memory we pray, may our lives reflect a measure of their bravery, dedication, and the purity of their souls. May their souls be bound up in the bond of eternal life. May they be remembered with honor. May they rest in peace at your right hand forever. And to that, we can all say Amen. I invite you all to unmute yourselves, and even though it will sound cacophonous, let us recite the Mourner's Kaddish together. Yit Gadal, Mial Ra Let us stand in silence as we remember the 6 million. Friends, you may be seated. I'm going to ask everyone to please mute themselves again, please. The exception, of course, of Doris. Thank you. Put myself back in the picture. Sorry. Elie Wiesel also said, when you listen to a witness, you become a witness. When you listen to a witness, you become a witness. And if you want to understand Doris Lazarus, then you need to appreciate Wiesel's words. Doris is the proud daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors. Both of her parents survived the ghetto over 2 years in Auschwitz-Birkenau in the Death March. Together, her parents survived a total of 6 death camps. Doris Lazarus has dedicated her life to Holocaust education and remembrance. She worked for Steven Spielberg's Shoah Foundation from 1994 to 1998 and interviewed over 125 Holocaust survivors from the Midwest as part of this project. Doris is a founding member of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. In 1998, she participated in the U.S. Holocaust Museum's first mission to Auschwitz. She is a dedicated member of their Children of Survivors group. Doris has given numerous lectures on the Holocaust, and she has been a docent at the Illinois Holocaust Museum for 12 years. She's also a certified speaker on the museum's second generation of speakers bureau list and is a moderator for the Illinois Holocaust Museum Survivor Hologram Theater. We are proud that Doris and her husband Ron are part of the Anshe Emet community. And she is the mother and bubby of Anshe Emet members, Jennifer Matthew, Talia Perla, Jonah, and Elijah Seidner. With no further ado, it is with great pride that we present our good friend and teacher and witness, Doris Lazarus.
Thank you, Rabbi, for that lovely introduction. Thank you, Rabbi and Chazan, for such a beautiful and inspiring service. I also want to thank Amy Karp for your warm attention, and Alan and the Anshe Emet Men's Club for sponsoring this event tonight. Finally, a huge thank you to Barry Balick, whose talented efforts and endless patience made tonight's event possible. I'm always grateful when I'm given the opportunity to fulfill my legacy of Holocaust remembrance, and it's especially meaningful today. When I share my family history, it creates a chain of memory that goes from my ancestors, it stretches from my ancestors to my descendants. The story you're going to hear is a story about love, loss, hope, and redemption. It's a sad story, but it has a happy ending. After hearing it, I hope that you'll all join me in becoming keepers of the memories. To remember is a sacred obligation. As far back as I can remember, I thought that everyone's mother and father had large blue numbers tattooed on their arm, that parents always screamed during the night, and that children had no grandparents. But then I learned I was the daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors. This family history has had a profound effect on my life. Our home was like a book with a chapter always open to the Holocaust. This painful history is in my heart and it inspires me to share my parents' stories. My parents' survival meant life for me, a life of being loved and cherished and cared for. I have never known hunger or cold or fear. I truly was their reason for living. and they told me that every single day. They poured all of their dreams into me, wanting me to have the life they never had. Today, we will remember my bubbies, my Zadies, my grandparents, my little siblings, and the countless family members that I never knew. They were among the 6 million innocents that were murdered. The number 6 million is so staggering. So I ask you please to think of 6 million ones, each one a universe, just like us, with hopes and goals and dreams. My mother, LEAH, was born in Ciechanów, Poland in 1922, the only daughter of 2 loving parents, Mendel and Esther Kirschenbaum. She had 3 brothers, Harry, Shmuel, and Shia. They were raised in a religious household. She led a very normal, typical life. She attended school, enjoyed socializing with friends, and belonged to HaShomer HaTzair, the Zionist group, which instilled in her a lifelong love of Eretz Yisrael, along with the courage, bravery, and leadership skills she would later need to survive in the death camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau. She learned how to sew at a young age, becoming an apprentice at age 12. Her mother told her she needed a portable profession. If her life had not been interrupted by the war, she probably would have married, raised a family, and stayed in Poland. I wish I knew more about the details of her life before everything changed. Although she had told me so much about her 6 years of captivity by the Nazis, she rarely spoke about her family life before the war. I've been told that the trauma of the separation and loss of her family must have been even more painful than the horrors of the ghetto and the death camp. And so the early memories remain within her. Life in my mother's shtetl was difficult, but simple, peaceful. Although anti-Semitism did exist in Poland as she was growing up, no one could have envisioned the horrors that awaited them. In 1933, Hitler came to power in Germany and began spreading his anti-Semitic hatred throughout the country. He used propaganda to spread vicious lies and rumors about the Jewish people. It was these words that enabled Hitler to carry out the murder and the robbery of the Jewish people in Europe. Words are so powerful. Words can cause fear, fear can cause hate, and hate can cause ordinary citizens to become willing executioners. In 1939, when my mother was just 17, Hitler's armies invaded Poland. Her life, her family, and her world was changed forever. First, her civil rights were taken away, and then her human rights. Jewish people had to wear a yellow star, one on the front and one on the back. They all now became targets for public humiliation. Being caught without the star was punishable by death. Jewish people could no longer walk in the street, only in the gutters, and never more than 2 together. When a Nazi approached, you had to drop to your knees, and he would say, "Good morning, swine." They couldn't own a radio, they had curfews, they could no longer enjoy the parks, sit on a bench, use public transportation, be included in sports activities, or attend school. Her father's business, their home, their money, and all personal possessions were stolen by the Nazis. They lived in fear of the future and prayed to see better days. My mother's oldest brother, Harry, escaped to Russia, where he survived the Holocaust in the Soviet Gulag. Although many of the men in her town were arrested or simply disappeared, no one believed the Nazis would ever harm the women and children. And although my mother could have escaped, she chose to stay with her family, promising her mother they would always remain together. Her bond with her mother was so loving, so strong, she never imagined she could or would ever have to exist without her. This was the beginning of the Nazis' plan to separate, isolate, and eventually murder all of the Jewish people in Europe. The Nazis were able to accomplish this with the cooperation and collaboration of many of the Polish people in her town. There were righteous individuals who did risk their lives to save and help Jewish people, but this was less than 1% of the population. Neighbors, co-workers, and even childhood friends all turned against the Jewish people in her town. One night while asleep in their home, the Nazis came. They broke in, terrorizing her family, beating them, giving them moments to pack up a lifetime. They grabbed what they could carry, a blanket, some clothes, a pot or pan. My mother, her parents, and her siblings, and all the other Jewish families in her town were forced from their homes that night. They were taken to the medieval castle in the center of the town. This castle had been used for centuries for festivals and various happy events. They were all forced onto trucks, the young, the old, the children, while being viciously beaten by the Nazis. My mother tells me how they beat her mother in the head because she could not run fast enough. And she remembers that she had to remain silent, keep running. If she stopped to help, they would have both been shot. My mother remembers the river of blood that flowed that night and could only ask why. But there was no why in the Holocaust. They were taken to the ghetto in the town of Neustadt. When they arrived, they were told by a Nazi that they had a few minutes to find a place to live, that anyone left on the streets would be shot. My mother banged on doors, begging to be let inside, but there was already unbearable overcrowding in every single apartment. Desperate to get off the streets, they ran into a horse stable. This became their home for the next 1.5 years, living and sleeping on the hay like animals. Their daily life became a struggle for food, warmth, and an effort to stay clean and healthy. It was nearly impossible to wash or change their clothing, and they were quickly covered in lice. My mother became ill with typhus, which is carried by lice. She was deprived of any medical attention. She suffered and she almost died. Her uncle Aaron was also ill and desperate for medical help. He removed his yellow star and escaped from the ghetto in the middle of the night. He returned to Chechanov, their hometown. His daughter Rivka and brother Binyamin were still hiding in the hometown. Some witnessed their reunion and reported them to the Gestapo. They were interrogated and tortured. The Gestapo had a doctor examine them to see if they were fit for slave labor. The doctor's findings did in fact clear them for deportation to a concentration camp, but the Gestapo decided to escalate their punishment. So by order of Adolf Eichmann, whose name appears on the bottom of this document, and I quote, the Jews, Aaron, Rivka, Binyamin, and 4 others in front of their people are to be hanged until dead. Their execution took place on April 27th, 1942. Rivka was 22 years old. In spite of the Nazis' plan to kill all of the Jewish people, life somehow went on in the horror of the ghetto. These brave people set up schools and secretly continued to study Torah and keep Judaism alive. The Jewish committee from her town started a soup kitchen, and it was this watery broth, all that they had to eat in a day, that kept them alive. Resistance also took place in the ghetto. There are so many stories of bravery and heroism, more than I could possibly tell you. The Jewish people did fight back without resources, without hope. Starving, dying, they resisted. Resistance came in many different forms. To smuggle a loaf of bread was to resist. To rescue a Torah scroll was to resist. Some kept secret journals or diaries. Some resisted by deciding to live one more day in this hell while maintaining their dignity, their humanity. So to quote Elie Wiesel, the question should be not why all the Jews did not fight back, but how so many did. In November of 1942, the Nazis began to evacuate the entire ghetto. My mother and the others were deceived and lied to. They were told they were being deported to the East for work and that families could stay together. They were told to pack a small bag, take what they could carry with them, even to bring valuables if they still had any, that they would need them where they were going. My mother, her parents, and her little brother were relieved to finally be leaving the ghetto. They could not imagine that anything could be worse. But then they were forced into the boxcars that were never meant to carry human beings. More than 100 people were sealed into each boxcar. They were forced to stand, packed tightly together. There was not a wasted inch of space. The boxcar was freezing. It was pitch dark. There was no food, no water, no toilets. Many stood in their own waste for 4 days and 4 nights. What else could they do? There was no air. It was suffocating and hard to breathe. Panic and claustrophobia set in immediately. Dehydration quickly followed. Thirst more tormenting than hunger. Mothers let their children lick their sweat to hydrate them. They were fighting so hard for their lives. People panicked and fainted. Some died standing up, not even allowed the dignity to lie down to die. Some were silent, conserving their saliva. The rest prayed. My heart breaks for my grandmother, grandfather, and my little Uncle Shoah, who never could have understood that this box is where they were spending the last day of their life. The train arrived in Auschwitz-Birkenau, the infamous death camp. Starved, disoriented, and terrified, my mother and her family were met by the Gestapo with their dogs and their whips. There was screaming, gunshots, and panic. It was dark, and families were quickly torn apart. Within minutes, everyone my mother loved was gone, and she was alone, an orphan and a slave. 9 out of every 10 people who arrived on the transports never even entered the camp. They were murdered in the gas chamber upon arrival. My mother said grieving was a luxury she couldn't afford. She immediately had to start fighting for her life. Every day, every minute, she was confronted with impossible dilemmas and obstacles, never knowing which choice could save her life. She was taken to a barracks. Her clothes and shoes were taken from her. Every young, modest woman suffered through a body search. The humiliation far greater than the pain. Then they shaved her head, robbing her of her femininity. Her name was taken too. 5 harsh, large blue numbers were tattooed on her left arm. She was given a filthy, rough striped prisoner dress to wear and mismatched wooden shoes that would cause blisters, pain, and infection, but would become one of her most important possessions. Without shoes, you could not live. She was given a small bowl to be used for both her food and toileting needs, with no opportunity to clean it in between, all part of the dehumanization process. By the time all of the new arrivals had been processed, they were unrecognizable, even to each other. My mother was assigned a bunk in a barracks originally built to hold horses. This filthy, unheated wooden structure held 1,000 women. Wooden bunks lined the walls, one stacked on top of the other. Each one filled with 10 women per narrow bunk. No pillows, no mattresses, no sheets, no blankets. The bunks were infested with rodents and lice, and sleep was impossible. There was appalling overcrowding and a chronic lack of water and latrines. In shock and exhausted, my mother prepared for her first night in Auschwitz. She was 19 years old. The women who had been there for some time told her, "Be strong, you are in a very bad place. They are killing people here. This is the end of the world. Forget about your home. In this place, you will be frozen, beaten, and starved. This is a place to die, not to live. My mother tried hard not to believe what she was hearing from the others about the thick black smoke billowing from the chimney stacks. She tried to block out what they were telling her, that the horrible smelling smoke from the chimney stacks was her family, that the ashes falling around her were all that was left of them. This the human mind could not grasp. My mother was trapped in a world she could never have imagined. One thing she knew for sure, every day would be worse than the one before. The camp was a closed world where inhumanity was routine, sadism and torture the norm. The inmates were quickly reduced to filthy, diseased, broken remnants of who they had been. Their death from hunger and sickness were all part of the system. Destruction by punishing, backbreaking, brutal work would serve the ultimate goal of murder as effectively as killing. Every morning between 3:30 and 4 a.m., she and the others were forced outside to line up for selection. They stood and shivered in the dark, in the bitter cold for hours to be counted. Forced to undress, they passed the infamous Dr. Mengele, who with a wave of his hand decided if they were fit for one more day of life. If one looked sick or weak, had any sores or swelling in their limbs, they were sent into the line for the gas chambers. Many times, even those who were fit, who managed to stay strong, were randomly selected and sentenced to death. Once you survived one selection, you lived in fear of future selections. To fall during roll call meant death. The clothes would freeze on your back, and hypothermia, frostbite, and gangrene would set in. Resistance took place even during these terrifying selections. My mother would tell me how just before selection, she would eat snow or grass so that she would appear to have a big stomach. She needed to hide how emaciated she really was. Other times, the girls would bite their fingers, rubbing a little blood onto their cheeks to hide the pale color of starvation. I'm not sure I will ever understand how she endured so much, yet fought so hard for one more day of life. She tells me that even in the most desperate of situations, the will to live is very powerful. And although she lost everyone and everything in Auschwitz, she never lost herself. She lived with dignity, always helping others, sharing her bread, although she herself was starving. After the brutal selection process, she was marched out to perform slave labor. There was never a purpose to this work. It was just another torturous plan devised by the Nazis to work the Jewish people to death. My mother was forced to march miles to work in hip-high snow in the 20 below zero Polish winters. She had no boots or coat, no socks, hat, or gloves. She worked from morning till night, beaten and humiliated by the Nazis as she broke heavy stones with a pickaxe. Her job was to move them from one side of the road to the other. It was backbreaking and almost unendurable. She was weak and undernourished, and the rocks weighed so much. If she paused in her work or even straightened her back, she was viciously beaten. One beating was so brutal it caused permanent deafness in her ear. She had to continue working as the blood flowed from the wound in her head. She was barely conscious. It was so cold that her hands froze on the shovel and wheelbarrow. Skin turned purple from the freezing conditions. At the end of the workday, she was forced to carry back the dead bodies of those who died, the women who were unable to survive the inhumane work conditions. By the time she got back to the barracks, she could barely crawl. But upon arriving back at the camp, the endless counting began again. The Nazis were very methodical, and everyone had to be accounted for, even the dead. I have asked my mother how she survived over 2 years in the death camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau, when staying alive for 24 hours was almost impossible. She said a lot of it was luck. Once the trains did not arrive, there were quotas to fill. The Nazis needed to select 1,000 women for the gas chamber. They started counting, and when they reached 1,000, the cutoff was right next to her, and she was spared. Another time, the Nazis ordered everyone out of the barracks in the middle of the night, all to be marked for death. My mother spotted a broom outside the barracks. She slipped out of line and started sweeping. The Nazis thought she was left there to clean the barracks, and again, her life was spared. I had asked my mother if she ever cried in Auschwitz, cried for her family, cried for the silence of the world. But she said, if you cried, you died. If you showed any weakness, you didn't survive the day. I believe my mother survived because she never gave up hope. She never stopped dreaming of freedom. She said even if she was imprisoned until the end of the war and barely alive, she would have crawled out and through the fence just to die free. In January 1945, the Russian army was advancing. The Nazis didn't want any prisoners left behind, no eyewitnesses to tell the world about their atrocities, their crimes against humanity. Because they didn't have time to kill the remaining Jewish people in Auschwitz, my mother, along with 60,000 other inmates, were forced onto the death march. They were all walking skeletons, and soon many became corpses. The Nazis forced them to run through ice and snow. The temperature was between 20 and 33 degrees below zero, the coldest winter ever reported in Polish history. They were given no food, no water. They were frozen, starving, and exhausted. They were brutally mistreated, whipped by guards, and attacked by dogs. There was no time to rest or to pause. Those who fell behind were shot. So many died from exhaustion and exposure. At times, when the guards needed to stop, they all just dropped onto the snow. Some of the women covering themselves with dead bodies to keep from freezing to death. My mother fought so hard for her life on the death march, swollen from hunger and frostbite, yet coaxing and dragging those too weak to walk to take one more step. After weeks of running, my mother was put in an open boxcar exposed to the elements. The train arrived in Ravensbrück, the women's medical experiment camp. There was death all around, decomposing bodies, women in the final stages of starvation, too weak to even move. From there, my mother was forced to march to yet another camp, Neustadt, on the border of Germany. Her legs were frozen and swollen, and she could barely walk. One morning, somewhere near the German border, the guards disappeared, and she was free. This was her liberation, the moment she had dreamed of. It should have been a joyous moment, but she was numb with the realization of all she had lost. She was totally alone in the world. Where could she go? She believed all of her family and friends were dead, that her community no longer existed. In the slim hope that anyone who might have survived would return home, she attempted to go back, but it wasn't safe. Although the Nazis stopped murdering the Jewish people at the end of the war, Poland was still very anti-Semitic. Many Jewish people who survived 6 years of the Holocaust and made it back to their homes were murdered by their former neighbors. Many Poles had taken over Jewish homes, properties, and businesses, and they didn't want to see the Jewish people coming back. The Holocaust was not only the greatest murder in history, it was also the greatest robbery. My mother feared for her life after the Holocaust as much as she did while in Auschwitz. She knew she had to get out of Europe. Nothing had changed. But before leaving the country, she kept a promise she had made to herself that if she survived Auschwitz, she would find her relatives, her uncles and cousin who had been hanged, and give them a proper burial. She did find their remains. Their hands were still tied behind their backs. The mayor of the city issued a permit for only one grave. In spite of the post-war chaos, she continued to search for her brother Harry. She found him in Bialystok 6 years after he had left home for Russia. They did not recognize each other. She made her way to Austria, mostly on foot, to a displaced persons camp in Bad Ischl, Austria. It was called the Golden Cross. This is where she met my father, Oscar Mosak. He was so alone. His young wife, Perla, 4-year-old son, Hirsch, and 6-year-old daughter, Miriam, had all been murdered upon arrival in Auschwitz. My heart aches as I think of them huddled in the gas chamber. So young, they barely knew freedom. The horror they must have seen as they left this world. Growing up, I never knew I really was my father's second family. Queerly haunted by his experiences, he kept his memories to himself. Some process trauma with words, some with silence. Secrets and silence were not uncommon in survivor homes. My father's experience during the war was very similar to my mother's. He was one of 8 brothers, born in Płońsk, Poland, the same city as Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion. He and only one brother survived 2.5 years in Auschwitz-Birkenau, followed by the infamous Death March, the Hell of Mauthausen, and finally the frozen underground death caves of Ebensee in Austria, considered to be one of the most diabolical and horrific death camps. It was here that he was liberated by the American army, weighing 63 pounds. The end of the war, while ending years of agony and deprivation, found my father struggling to regain his health. My mother and father knew each other for just 2 weeks in the DP camp when he proposed. I'm alone, you're alone, let's be alone together, was a common proposal at the time. He had papers to come to America. My mother said yes. Yes to a future, to dreams, to possibilities. It took another 3 years before the United States would allow them to emigrate. They had to climb the Austrian mountains to escape into the free zone of Germany. As you can see in these photos, my father could never part with the striped prison jacket he was forced to wear in Auschwitz. In 1948, my parents came to Chicago to rebuild and reconstruct the lives they had lost. They came with little more than each other. My mother was driven to work hard, learn the language, and move forward. It wasn't easy. No one helped her. Yes, she survived, was liberated, but neither she nor many other survivors could ever be liberated from their memories. Every morning when I would call her, even 70 years later, she would tell me that she wakes up in Skokie, but she sleeps in Auschwitz. The nightmares continue, the screams and cries during the night. Upon awakening, she couldn't believe that she was not cold or hungry or hunted. She never looked back to the time her life was interrupted, never thought about who she could have been, was never bitter. She chose to be better. She just wanted to move on, to live. She lived her life with dignity and purpose. Every minute of her life was a teaching moment for others. She knew how to sew, so she put a sign in the window and started a business, promising herself she would never be cold or hungry or homeless again. After a full day of cooking, cleaning, and caring for a sick husband and 2 daughters, she would begin to sew, spending most of the night at her sewing machine. I always believed those stitches took her far away from the Holocaust. It kept her hands and her mind busy so that she would not remember what she couldn't forget. She supported our family of 4, piano lessons, Hebrew school, college. She saved every penny, giving more to her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren than she ever kept for herself. This was her greatest pleasure in life. She never stopped dreaming. She wanted to live to see me get married and have children. She dreamt about lighting the candles at my children's bar and bat mitzvahs and attending their high school and college graduations. 16 years ago, she watched my daughter Jennifer stand under the wedding chuppah to marry Matthew. The dream continued when precious Talia, Perla, Jonah, and Elijah came into our lives. The 4th generation after the Holocaust, making me a grandmother and my mother a great-grandmother. She lived to see me become what I always yearned for, a bubby, pouring all the Yiddishkeit I learned from her into my grandchildren, teaching them to love the Jewish traditions that were almost extinguished. These were moments my mother could never have imagined during the darkest years of her life. She lived to see our family tree grow, new branches added. She survived to delight in her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and to buy things that are blue, her favorite color, probably because the sky was the only color she saw for years while in Auschwitz. I could always see signs of where she had been in her eyes when we would eat in restaurants and a basket full of warm bread was brought to the table. I could see it in the way she would hold a cup of tea, her hands cradled around the cup for warmth. Subtle hints of where she had been, what she had survived. But at the end, she had everything she always wanted, and she was free. Please remember her. The best thing in life is to be remembered. Thank you. It's been a privilege.
Certainly the privilege has been ours, Doris. What a remarkable presentation and a most appropriate way to commemorate Yom HaShoah through the spirit of your mother
Thank you.
and your father. If there are any questions, I ask that you put them in the chat, and I'm happy to field them for you.
Thank you.
While we're waiting, Doris, if you would talk a little bit about your work at the Illinois Holocaust Museum.
Sure. Thank you. I've dedicated my life to remembrance, education, advocacy, and I felt so blessed when I heard that the museum was going to open 12 years ago this month. So I applied to become a docent, and I went through 6 months of training, became certified, and have been leading student groups, adult groups, and hundreds of visitors to the museum in the past 12 years. I also, as you know, I'm on their Speakers Bureau. So I have the honor of going to schools and different organizations in the community and synagogues and sharing my parents' history, keeping their memory alive. You also mentioned that I had taken the training to work with our Hologram Theater at the Illinois Holocaust Museum, and I'm certainly happy to talk about what that experience is like as well.
Well, we'd love to hear about that. But before we get there, would you talk a little bit about how you experience school-age children coming to the Holocaust Museum, comments they make, and how you think they are affected by what they're seeing at the Illinois Holocaust Museum?
Thank you. I work with students of all ages as far as exposing them to our permanent exhibition, which is the chronological history of the Holocaust. We recommend that for students 7th grade and over. I find that the students tend to be quiet at times, but then I hear back from the teachers about how they were processing everything that they were seeing and hearing. I can tell you that I've been asked so many questions that showed me they really were engaged and listening. And I always tell them I learn so much from my students. What effect do I hope the museum will have on them? I hope that they will take with them the personal stories. Our goal at the museum is to get our visitors to connect with one. And I hope they will take the stories that highlight the astonishing courage and inspiration that our survivors have shown, that they can take the lessons they learned about courage and keep it with them should they ever face challenges in their own life. And of course, we want all our visitors to be inspired to stand up, speak out, and make a difference, because we believe that everybody can and everybody should.
It is such powerful work. It's so important. And I want to just ask you, on behalf of Phil Stern, do you speak to minority students? And if so, how do they respond to your story?
Thank you. Did you say minority students?
Yeah, minority students. Do you speak
Yes.
to minority students? And if so, how do they respond to your story?
Yes, we speak to minority students all the time. And I have to say again, they're very engaged. And I think that they are listening, and I think they're taking lessons home with them.
I think, as we all know, the numbers of survivors are diminishing. And the Illinois Holocaust Museum did something remarkable by creating a living memory, if you will, that will stand the test of time, a hologram. Could you talk a little bit about that and your thinking about it, and how effective do you believe it is, not having a living, breathing person, but a hologram instead?
Thank you. Well, sadly, in the future, we all are going to be living in a world without our precious survivors. The hologram is the way that we and future generations will interact with a Holocaust survivor. The project, called New Dimensions in Testimony, was started by the Shoah Foundation, which now is part of USC in California. In their collection, they have 21 Holocaust survivors from all over the world. Our museum has about 7. We hope to increase, as does the Shoah Foundation in California. Their goal is to have 100 holograms in their collection. It is a rather grueling process for our survivors to go through. They go to USC. They're put into the green bubble, the same bubble where Avatar, with all its special effects, was filmed. And over a period of a week, they are asked 2,000 questions that scholars have put together, thinking that these are the questions an audience would ask of a Holocaust survivor. And then we, as the moderators in the specially built hologram theater, rephrase the question from the audience directly to the survivor who answers the questions. It's amazing technology. The Illinois Holocaust was the first museum in the world to have the holographic theater. Now the Holocaust Museum in Dallas does. Several other museums, like the Museum of Jewish Heritage and Candles Museum in Indiana, also have the hologram, but it's in the beta form. It is not in the specific theater that we have. So if you have thought about coming to meet a survivor's hologram, I encourage you to do so.
Do you find that people forget that they're watching a hologram and actually think that they're hearing a living, breathing person speaking to them?
That is such a great question, Rabbi. It is so realistic that even though in my introduction, I will ask the audience to ask me the question so that I can rephrase, I find that they ask the hologram directly the question because it is so realistic. And oftentimes they're a little bit hesitant to ask the question, thinking that it could upset them.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to turn to Sheila Roden Novak. Thanks, Doris, for your wonderful presentation about your mother's story. Were you able to interview your parents for the Spielberg archives? And are your siblings equally engaged?
So thank you. And hi, Sheila. Great question. So the Shoah Foundation started their interviews over a 4-year process from 1994 to 1998. My father had passed away in 1976. As I said in my lecture, he was clearly so traumatized by his experiences, he chose not to speak. And so everything that I've learned about my father, I learned from research. My mother, of blessed memory, was among the first to be interviewed. They thought best that children did not interview their own parents, so she was interviewed by another interviewer. And as time goes on, I see how historically important it is to have her eyewitness testimony documented. As far as other siblings involved, there is one other sibling, but uninvolved.
One last question from Jeremy.
Sure.
Schaefer or Schaefer? I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Did your mother ever talk about the change in attitudes in her town? Was it a swift change as Nazis moved in, or a gradual shift? Is there something we can learn as a warning sign of societal change for the worse?
Thank you. My mother said that growing up, the Jewish people in her town that had businesses had good relations with their Polish neighbors. She went to a strictly Jewish school. She did tell me that when she and the girls would walk to school, some of the Polish boys would throw stones at them, and in Polish say, Jews go to Palestine. So, of course, there were the anti-Semitic feelings. Nobody could imagine they would be fueled to the extent that they were, but that happened very quickly as soon as the Nazis occupied. I understand, I guess I have a hard time understanding need and greed, but that really pushed the Polish people to a different level in the way they treated the Jews, because they began taking their property and their homes. The final part of the question
was, is there something we can learn as a warning sign of societal change for the worse? How can we apply the lessons of your parents, but the lessons that you have learned to the present day?
Okay, thank you for repeating. First of all, I think we all have to strengthen our Jewish ties, build very strong Jewish communities. Always, always be aware and prepared for anti-Semitism because it comes in many different forms and we all need to confront it. What are the lessons learned? I hope, as we see since the Holocaust, genocides continue, hatred, discrimination, ethnic cleansing, we still see it. I hope that through education, we can learn from each other. We can get into dialogues with people from different backgrounds, dialogues that are productive, and just learn about not just tolerance, but acceptance and respect.
Mm. Well, I can't thank you enough, but I'll read Barry's post because I think he says it so well. Thank you, Doris, for all you do. You are a brave witness to this terrible time in the history of the world and the Jewish people. I see you as a hologram reflecting the facts of the Holocaust as a living witness. Beautiful words and a remarkable presentation. We are so proud that you are a member of our community as well as a living witness. We're going to end on a note of hope, I believe.
As we observe Yom HaShoah this year, through the Ani Ma'amin video and this video, we are looking to music as a way to bring healing and comfort. We are in need of healing for a multitude of reasons, and our wound of the Shoah is ever present. This choral setting, called I Believe, is based on words found after World War II. Their origins are unclear, but their message is quite clear and is one of faith. I believe in the sun, even when it is not shining. I believe in love, even when I don't feel it. I believe in God, even when God is silent. This piece is by Mark Miller and is sung by Shirenu under the direction of Christy Childs-Twilley. It builds softly, like small waves meant to carry our worries out to sea. As it grows and then diminishes, we hope you breathe easily and allow your worries and sadness to lessen. Thank you for listening.
We look to Alan Mintz as we close our program for last words.
Doris, thank you very, very much for being with us this evening. As you can see from many of the comments in the chat, your words were so moving and meaningful to us.
Thank you.
We thank you, Men's Club, the congregation, Anshe Emet, for all of your work, for all of your devotion, and for sharing such deep emotionality and intricate parts of your family's life and history. I would like to then say that for those of our listeners who may be inclined to provide some form of contribution and donation send it to the Illinois Holocaust Museum in honor of Doris and thank her for her evening's presentation tonight. Visit the museum, continue to support the programs of the museum, expand them. Rabbi, thank you very much for your facilitation for tonight's program. And finally, Barry Ballack, for all your coordination and helping put the program together. We look forward to seeing many of you again at many of our new Men's Club's programs in the upcoming weeks. Just a quick note that next Wednesday evening, there will be a program. Check your synagogue website and the Boker Tov for the further announcements. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining with us tonight. Amy Karp, finally, for your coordination of all the activities as part of the Zoom program. And we wish you all of you a good evening and a Yom HaShoah that was as much as meaningful for us as was for all of you. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Erev Tov, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night, Doris.
Thank you. Good night, Ellen. Thank you. Good night, Fran.
Good night.
So much.
Good night.